Please be aware, in this podcast series we talk about all areas of safeguarding, which some people may find upsetting. So please make sure you're okay listening to today's topic. Be mindful of those around you, such as children, that you might not want to listen in. Hi, I'm SSS Safeguarding Director Sam Preston.
And I'm former head teacher and content author Sara Spinks.
Today we're discussing a complex issue that affects education systems worldwide: teacher shortages. Now, if you're in England, you might think this is a universal issue, but it turns out that it's not actually the case. In fact, some countries have never reported a teacher shortage at all. So what's going on? What do you think, Sarah?
Well, very interesting for me, this one, because I used to be the recruitment retention strategy manager for a large urban local authority. And the question of teacher shortages is definitely fascinating and frankly a bit puzzling. And I think many people assume that shortages are just a result of not paying teachers enough or maybe challenging working conditions. But it sounds like there's a lot more to it than that.
Absolutely. And we've had some great insights from the recent report by Professor Stephen Gorard from Durham University. Now, he's the director at the Evidence Centre for Education, and his team looked at dozens of education systems to try and understand why some countries have shortages and others don't. And they examined everything from teacher pay to broader social factors, using data from large-scale studies like TALIS and Eurydice.
And what did they find? Were pay and working conditions as central to the issue as we'd expect?
Well, that's the interesting part. While pay and conditions are factors, they're not as critical as we might think. The study found that shortages aren't driven by any single factor, but are instead sort of influenced by a mix of social, cultural, and economic variables. So, for example, a society's level of respect for teachers plays a massive role. So, in countries like Singapore, South Korea, and Finland, teachers are held in high esteem by both the public and the government, and they don't experience shortages. But in contrast, in countries like England, France, and Japan, teachers report feeling undervalued, and these nations have persistent shortages.
That's really fascinating. And it suggests that teacher shortages are as much about society's perception of teaching as a profession as they are about the specific conditions of the job itself.
Exactly. So Professor Garard's team found that societal respect has a huge impact on whether people choose to enter and stay in the teaching profession. So in England, for instance, only 25% of teachers feel valued by society. And even worse, only about 10% feel that they're valued by policymakers. So when teachers don't feel respected, they're much more likely to leave the profession, and also fewer younger people want to enter it.
And that respect, or lack of thereof, seems to have that ripple effect on other areas, doesn't it? For example, if people think of teaching as a low-status job, it makes it easier for policymakers to cut resources, to increase teacher workloads, without much public backlash.
Yeah, and that's a really great point, Sarah. The report highlights that in places where teachers are highly regarded, teaching tends to be more competitive. And interestingly, some countries even have waiting lists for teacher positions. In Greece, for instance, people have to wait to get a teaching job even after they're fully trained because it's seen as such a desirable profession. It's in stark contrast to England, where we actually reject a significant number of teacher training applicants each year, often with no clear rationale.
I know, that is so surprising. So instead of addressing the shortage with more hiring, we're turning away potential teachers. That almost feels counterproductive.
It is counterproductive. And it's even more concerning when you consider that many of these rejected applicants are from ethnic minority backgrounds, which doesn't help with diversity in the profession. It's almost as if the system itself is creating barriers that exacerbate the shortage problem.
So basically there's a missed opportunity there, isn't there? Not only to bring in more teachers, but also to create a teacher workforce that is more representative of the communities that they serve, And it would seem to be a critical part of addressing issues like hard to staff schools and disadvantaged areas.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the report points out that these issues are particularly pronounced in schools with high levels of student disadvantage and poverty. One of the recommendations is to address these, quote, hard to staff schools by distributing students from low-income backgrounds more evenly across schools. And by doing this, the workload and challenges faced by teachers in those schools might be reduced, making the job more appealing.
That's a very interesting idea. I mean, it's a reminder that the issue isn't just about having enough teachers, it's about having enough teachers in the right places.
Yeah.
Were there any other interesting findings, Sam?
Yeah, the report found that teacher shortages tend to be less severe in countries with a few specific conditions. So, for example, countries with higher population density often have fewer issues, likely because teachers have better access to resources and possibly shorter commutes. Also, in places where other graduate professions don't pay substantially more than teaching, shortages are less common. So this means that when teaching salaries are more comparable to other professions, fewer teachers leave for other careers.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. If teaching is seen as financially competitive, it naturally is going to attract more people.
Yeah.
But you mentioned that pay wasn't the only factor, right?
Yeah, right. And that's key. Pay alone doesn't explain the differences in shortage levels between countries. So the study also looked at workplace stress and found that while it's related to teacher shortages, it's not a defining factor. So this means that while reducing stress could help, it's not a silver bullet, which is often portrayed, certainly in the UK. So the broader picture is about how the teaching profession is viewed and valued by society as a whole.
So it sounds like this is really about building a culture of respect and appreciation for teachers. Yeah. And when that respect is missing, as it seems to be here in England, it creates a cycle of low retention and recruitment challenges that's really hard to break.
Yeah, absolutely. So the report argues that if policymakers truly want to address teacher shortages, they need to focus on changing societal attitudes towards teachers and, in effect, the profession. So this means not only improving conditions, but also elevating the perception of teaching as a respected and rewarding career. And without this cultural shift, even the best policies might struggle to make a lasting impact.
I think that's so true. It seems like there's a lot to think about and a need for more comprehensive approach. Do you think this report will actually influence policy?
Well, it's hard to say. It's certainly a step in the right direction. Professor Gorar's work is making it clear that the solution isn't just about tweaking budgets or adjusting teacher salaries. That's not going to do it. It's about building that culture where teachers feel respected and valued by their students, by parents, by the media, and by policymakers alike.
And I think we missed the golden opportunity after the pandemic, because I think, I think after the pandemic, the public's perception of teaching definitely raised when they were having to home educate. And I think that's something everyone can agree on. Teaching is, it really is one of the most important professions out there. And it does deserve the respect and appreciation that comes with that. And hopefully, I'm really hoping that this report will inspire more people to think about what we can do to support our teachers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do hope so, Sarah. For those interested in reading the full report, and it's really, it is super interesting. It really is. It's titled, "What are the key predictors of international teacher shortages?" It's a comprehensive piece that dives deep into the data, and it covers, everything we've talked about today and more.
Oh, thanks for breaking this down for me. So I'll definitely be looking up the full report, and I encourage our listeners to do the same, really, because it's an issue that affects all of us that are involved in education, whether we're, and people beyond, because, whether we're parents or educators or just people who care about the future. This is a very important issue for us all,
Yeah, it is. So we'll wrap up there. I'd strongly recommend reading it. It's very, very interesting, and it certainly challenges some of the perceptions that are portrayed out there in the media, that's for sure. So I'm sure you and I, Sarah, because I know this is an area you're really interested in.
I am.
And I'm sure we're going to keep this conversation going. And hopefully by sharing information and by keeping this discussion going, we'll contribute to getting to a place where we are starting to promote that whole ethos where every teacher feels valued and respected.